combine our strive towards achieving the SDGs and trade policy. Yesterday I went to the ministerial conference and a couple of countries really emphasized the importance of the SDGs. For example, Indonesia, Kenya, Argentina, they all said we need to promote the SDGs at the same time when we think about trade policies. But then the question is, what does this actually mean? So what role has trade to play in this interaction between the SDGs and development and trade? So this was the main question that we asked, and actually this session is based on a book that we launched in July this year called Win-Win International Trade Help Meet the SDGs. I brought 3 copies along, so anybody who would like to have a hard copy can get one after this session. The book is also available online for free, so you can also download it for free. And I have the great honor to have 2 of the authors, of the chapter authors, with me today. One is Guido Porto. He's a professor of economics at the University of La Plata here in Argentina. And he was previously an economist at the World Bank. And he's one of the leading economists when it comes to questions of trade, and especially trade and poverty. Then we also have with us Frans lammersen. Frans is a principal administrator with the OECD, and he's responsible for trade and development in the Development Assistance Committee. And I guess he's one of the best experts in this world on aid for trade, and today he will talk about the question of aid for trade. And then last but not least, we have Yann Duval. He's currently chief of the trade policy and facilitation section at UNESCAP in Bangkok, and he just led the preparation of a new report called Channeling Trade and Investment into Sustainable Development. And so he will give comments on this book, and he, also share insights of this report that he just launched in October. So welcome all of you. And let me now start giving you an overview of this book, and then we will go into detail into different chapters of this book in order to give you a little bit a better idea what we think about this nexus between trade and SDGs, and also then to have a discussion at the end. So we will have a presentation about 15 minutes each, and then we still have about 20 to 30 minutes for Q&As. So actually when we started this book project, it was in late 2015, and we went through the SDG documents, and when you have a close look, you can see that there are only very few references to trade. So trade is basically seen in the SDGs as a means of implementation, but there are not many indicators when it comes to trade. And a lot of people think about this trade and SDG linkage as going through the trade growth, and then through growth we can promote development. However, we think that there are other more direct linkages between trade and SDGs. So in this book we want to move beyond this income and growth argument to really try to identify the direct linkages between trade and the SDGs. And so the overall question is how to maximize the benefits of trade opening while limiting the risks. So in this book we try really to cover all SDGs, and we divide it into 4 parts. We first look at poverty, hunger and inclusive growth, then trade and SDGs or sustainable growth, trade and education, health, and then other linkages. I just want to walk you through the book a little bit more in detail. So the first chapter is on trade and poverty reduction. Of course, this is a very key question that we all have to ask ourselves when we think about smart trade policies. And so Guido will, in his presentation, show you the latest evidence of this interrelationship between trade and poverty reduction. Then we have a chapter on trade and hunger, written by Will Martin. Some of you might know him. He's a renowned expert on agriculture, and he tries to see what are good trade policies when it comes to agricultural trade. Then a topic that is now very much on the agenda of many people is this question of gender. How can women benefit more actively from trade? And we have a chapter here by Ben Shepard and Susan Stone, which tries to bring together all the latest evidence on this aspect of trade and women. Then another important question that was especially important over the last years is the question whether the trade will create jobs or not. So we have here a chapter on trade and employment. Another important aspect is of course inequality, whether trade contributes to inequality or whether it can mitigate inequality. So when it comes to sustainable growth, the book covers the question of environment. We have Dale Andrew, a former OECD staff, who looks at this question. Then another colleague from OECD who tries to see how trade and climate change are related. And of course, with the Paris Accord, this question is very important. How can we make sure that we achieve the climate goals while also promoting a smart trade policy? Then a topic that is now debated not too far from here is about fisheries. We still have about 30 billion of US dollars that go into subsidies for fishery. What can be done in this area? Then trade and water. A lot of countries in this world suffer from a water shortage, and can trade help to balance this water shortage? Another question that is of course important is labeling and food safety, covered by Norbert Wilson. And now we go to part 3 on trade and education and health. We have one chapter by Ike Lim, Pamela Apasa and Aline Horst from the WTO and the OECD. They look at the fact that education is a service that is more and more traded internationally. As you know, countries like Australia, they try to promote education as one of their key export areas in terms of services. Then I wrote a chapter on medical products and pharmaceuticals, and I will go into detail in a second. Then we also have a chapter on trade and health services. Of course, all of you know that the so-called medical tourism is booming, where patients, they move across borders to seek medical treatment in other countries for various reasons. But we also see a lot of healthcare workers moving across borders to go into other countries to work there as healthcare workers. And so the book finishes with kind of other linkages between trade and SDGs. We look at urbanization, whether urbanization can basically be a driver of trade opening or vice versa. Then we have a chapter by Marcelo Olarriaga who looks at infrastructure and development. Of course, infrastructure for us as ADB is a key topic. And then we have the chapter by Frans, Lammersen and William Heinz who look at this question of aid for trade. So as I said, the book can be downloaded for free. And now I will just give you an overview of some of the chapters. So I will start with the chapter on medical products and pharmaceuticals, and then we will continue with Guido, who will talk about the question of poverty and trade, followed by Frans on aid for trade. So when we look at these aid and trade linkages, we can distinguish between indirect and direct linkages. Of course, when it comes to direct linkages, we know that trade leads to more growth, and this can, of course, then also help people to access and their spending on medical treatments. But we also know when you open up to trade, you then also import a lot of different foods, so this can also help to diversify your diet, but of course there's also a risk that you eat more unhealthy food. And then there's also this link to basically food safety, whether when you open to trade you're exposed to more safe or unsafe food. Usually we tend to say that a trade opening helps you to increase the food safety standards. And then we also have a lot of direct links. One goes through medicines and related to trade, and I will talk about this in detail, and the other one goes through services. And in all the 4 modes of supply, we have health services that are supplied across borders. So when I was working for the WTO in 2012, I tried to better understand which are actually the products that are traded and that can be classified as health products. And so I went through the HS classification and identified these 6 groups of health products. And so we have in this left-hand side group dosified medicines, bulk medicines, inputs that go into the pharmaceutical industry. And then on the right-hand side, chemical inputs, hospital and laboratory inputs, and also medical technology equipments. And then I try to see whether these what's actually the trade in these products. And as you can see, the trade is really increasing a lot in recent years. And this trade is basically dominated by developed countries. So you have here the red bar is Europe and Central Asia, but this is basically the EU who trades a lot of these products. And then we also have North America, so US and Canada, which are very dominant in this trade of these health products. And the developing countries, they still play a minor role, even though this role is increasing. But of course, this is a market where most of the trade is actually undertaken by developed countries, because they spend most on health at the current moment. When we look at the applied tariffs, we see that the applied tariffs have come down over the years. For example, in South Asia in 2002, we had on average applied tariffs that were higher than 15%, and now these tariffs have come dramatically down. However, when we look at certain countries, we still have kind of high tariffs. For example, India or Pakistan, they try to still protect their markets, especially for pharmaceuticals. And one can argue maybe that there is an attempt to protect their domestic pharmaceutical industry. However, we even find very high tariffs for countries like Djibouti, where there's certainly no pharmaceutical industry, or also Ghana, Laos. And then, of course, these are only the tariffs. We also know that there are a lot of non-tariff measures that are important, but we don't have much evidence yet. So in this book chapter, we present some anecdotal evidence about NTMs, but we really think that there is a lot of NTMs that prohibit trade in these health products. Sorry for the font, it didn't display my font correctly, but anyway, it looks like machine typed. So there is one study that was done by Ben Shepard a couple of years ago. He looked whether the trade logistics have a positive impact on the distribution of vaccines. As you might know, over the last couple of years, a lot of international agencies, that they spend literally billions to vaccinate people in developing countries. And when you want to vaccinate people, you have to always observe a cold chain from the production place until the vaccination. And so basically Ben looked at this question whether if a country has a better trade logistics, where this also helps to have higher immunization rates. And indeed there is a positive relation between these trade logistics and the immunization rates. Then I did a paper that we just published this year on insulin, because insulin has two HS codes that allow you to really look at the trade of insulin very specifically. And we can see that insulin is traded now very strongly across the world. And this especially started in the year 2000. The blue bar shows the imports of OECD of insulin by OECD countries, and the red line by non-OECD countries. And it kind of shows you also that the world is suffering from an obesity crisis, which of course triggers diabetes, and then triggers this import of insulin. And so you can see that more and more insulin is traded internationally, and it's needed across the world. And then we basically checked how the prices differ across countries. So when a country imports this insulin from non-OECD countries, they pay a much lower price than when they import it from an OECD country. This basically reflects that there is some branded products where you have a substantially higher price than when you have a generic insulin import from a developing country. But then when we try to also see what are other price determinants of insulin, we also found that these companies, that they really try to price to the market. So if the GDP per capita is higher, they charge higher prices. But they also charge higher prices if the out-of-pocket payments are higher. So if people need to pay out-of-pocket, they actually know that they can charge a higher price because they are not confronted with one single buyer, but they are basically, they have a lot of people who want to have access to this insulin, so they can actually charge a higher price. We also found that countries that import from many other countries, they tend to have a lower price. So this shows that trade can bring down prices because you can basically play on the competition. So when you open your markets and you try to basically play these suppliers against each other, you can bring prices down. And of course, trade opening is important to get access to insulin. But it's of course not enough to make sure that everybody has access, because a lot of barriers behind the border, and you need to make sure that you also tackle these the domestic issues to make sure that people have access to life-saving drugs. So our conclusion is that this international trade is very much important for the procurement of these health products. It's a market that is developed, that is dominated by developed countries, but of course developing countries now come into this market very strongly. And we also have seen that tariffs are falling, but they are still substantive, and also NTMs play an important role. And we also saw, for the case of this insulin, that when you apply a smart trade policy, you can really try to bring the prices of health products down and improve the access to all these drugs. And then, so we think it's so the trade in health products is an important and necessary condition, but it's not sufficient to, of course, improve the health system. So this was an overview of the main findings of the chapter on trade and health products. Let me now turn to Guido, and he will walk you through this chapter on trade and poverty. I think it's a very fascinating question, and so please, the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you for coming. Let me quickly thank the organizers for the invitation to this event and to participate in this book. The theme of my presentation today is trade, poverty, eradication, and the Sustainable Development Goals. More concretely, what we try to do in this chapter for the book is to think about whether trade can actually help achieve the poverty goal of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The poverty goal is goal 1 out of a total of 17. And it reads, by 2030, eradicate extreme poverty for all people everywhere, currently measured as people living on less than $1.25 a day. So rather than answering this question, which is obviously very complex, what we try to do in the chapter is to think about whether trade can help achieve this goal and how, or whether trade can instead go against it, and also how. And in both cases, to try to think about what we as economists can do about that. No? Okay, so a little bit of context for my presentation today, for the material I will be presenting. So when you look at the trade and poverty literature, there is basically, you can find two strands of literature. There is the macro literature. Okay, so basically the mechanism there goes from trade to growth. And if growth is pro-poor, then you can go from a link going from trade to poverty. Then there is a micro channel, which is a much more static approach, no? But at the same time much more detailed, because we look at the impacts of trade at a very micro level analysis, at the micro level units of the economy. So given my research background for this presentation, for the chapter, I focus exclusively on the microeconomic channel without prejudices for the macro channel, no? But I am a micro guy. So what I will do is I will spend about, 5 minutes talking about giving you some analytical framework to think about trade and poverty, again, on the micro channel, and then I will give you some illustration of the type of results that you can get from this strand of literature for a few countries they are there in Nigeria, Ghana, Malawi, the Gambia, Uganda, and South Africa. Okay? Essentially, you can do this for many other countries as well. But I have results for these 6 countries in the book, in the chapter. Very well. So the microeconomic mechanism, basically the idea is that the theory postulates that trade affects prices. No? So when you put a tariff, when you put an anti-dumping or a safeguard, you affect the prices of the goods that are traded. And then when there is a change in prices, this can have an effect on the household, our micro unit, on a dual role. So there is an effect of the household as a consumer, because prices now are different and the household has to pay changed prices for the goods they are consuming. And then the other role is the role of the income of the household as an income earner, whether producing the good itself or via the labor market. Okay? So this is, for example, the role of the consumer, of the household as a consumer. Here we have a good and a demand curve, all right? And if the price is P0 initially, when you let's say you put a tariff, so the price goes up. Okay? And this, since prices are higher, this entails a welfare loss for the household that you can measure. If you know the demand curve, you can measure that with the gray area in the figure. The flip side of that is the role of the household as a producer. So now we have to know the supply curve, and if prices go up from P0 to P1, for example, due to protection, then of course prices are higher and producers are going to be better off, and you can measure that with that, calculating this area in the figure. Now, in many of these countries, the households are producers and consumers at the same time. For example, they produce some maize and they consume some of it and sell the rest in the market, or vice versa. And then what you have is a net consumer. The net consumer is one, a household that at the prevailing prices consumes more than what it produces, and then so price increases will hurt net consumers, and you can quantify that by calculating this area here. And of course, for net producers, well, I don't have the gray area here, but the higher prices for net producers are going to be beneficial, and it's this area over there. Okay, so what we can do, and what we do typically in this literature, is we can quantify those gray areas. Okay. And I don't even know why I have this slide here, but just trust me that we can put this into some formulas, and basically we can write the indirect utility function of the household. The household here is H, and we can get an expression like this one, which is a first-order approximation to the gray areas that I plotted before. Okay, so basically phi is captures the income share of the good, captures the production side of the mechanism. S is the budget share, how much relative to your total expenditure you allocate, household H allocates to good I, and the delta of the logarithm of the prices, how the price changes with a trade policy that you are assessing. So if a tariff, it goes up. If it is an export tax, it can go down, things like that. But then you get very clearly that if the price goes up, so the change in the price is positive, then the net producer, which is the one who has 5 greater than S, benefits, and the net producer, which is the net consumer, which is the one that has S greater than 5, loses. So this is the net producer, net consumer proposition, if you want, from Deaton. Now, before I go to measure these things and show you some results to have a little bit more fun, I want to extend the mechanisms to include also another term in the income of the household, which is W, which is a wage. Okay, so now we will allow for effects of trade via the labor market. So it can be through wages, employment, and stuff like that. And what you have to do is simply extend the formula before adding a term which captures, this is 5W, which is basically the fraction of the income of the household that comes from wages, and then the epsilon, which is the response of the wage. So you have to measure that, but we can incorporate into the analysis labor market responses. And now, of course, then the net consumer, net producer proposition stands the same as before, except that the net producer will not include now includes also responses via the labor market. It's fairly intuitive. Okay, then we need some theory also for the price changes. Let me go over this very quickly. I want to illustrate some of the basic mechanisms here with a simple assumption of the law of one price. So the price, the domestic price, will be the international price plus the wages that you get from transportation costs or trade policy, and also there can be a gamma, which is some domestic infrastructure cost internally, domestic costs of distribution. If it is unexportable, then you have to net out the trade policy and the transportation costs. So for example, an export tax on wheat reduces the prices of bread, that kind of things. If it is an importable, a tariff increases the price. Anyway, so now what I want to do is very quickly show some results, some numbers. And what I have to do is I did two things. So first I need some household survey data for the micro unit, the household. So I got data for, again, Nigeria, Ghana, Malawi, the Gambia, Uganda, and South Africa. From those data, you can retrieve some of the components of the formula, the income, the S, and the fees, the FIs, the shares, the income shares, and the budget shares. Then I went and I got data for tariffs, on a bunch of agricultural and manufactured products. And then this is a simulation because, of course, the tariffs are in place, but we basically assume a full tariff liberalization to see what happens. And then you can use these formulas to compute the price changes, and these other formula here to compute the welfare effects. And the interesting thing is that we have one of these numbers for each household in the data, so we can do lots of things with that, statistical analysis with all these observations. So let me show you some of the things that we can do. For example, this is Nigeria. So here I have the distribution of income. The poor are on the left, and on your left, and the rich are on the right. Then I have the short dash curve is the consumption effect, so basically the budget share effect. This is the income effect, the FIs, okay? And this is the net effect of the two. And this is the zero. So on the left, I have the percentage change in welfare. A positive effect, for example, 0.1 means 10% gain, minus 0.1 is a 10% loss here. Okay, so this is, for example, this is interesting because you see how here you have this, in this case, tariff liberalization would be anti-poor. So there are losses for the poor and gains for the rich. There are consumption gains across the entire income distribution, but there are income losses also across the entire income distribution, and it happens to be the case that the consumption gains are lower for the poorest households here, and consequently the net effect is negative for the poor, whereas it is positive for the richer. No, they are not necessarily rich. They are richer than these other guys. But different scenarios. This is interesting. One of the interesting things about this analysis is that you can do this for different countries and get different results. For example, in the case of Ghana, it's totally different. So now, again, the labeling is the same, but now you see the blue curve is everywhere positive. Okay, so there are gains for every at every point of the income spectrum. The gains are a little bit higher for the rich, again over 10% if you're over there, whereas here it is more like 5%. Okay, but they are positive for everyone. So, not for everyone, but on average at the different points of the income distribution. So it's a different message from the one we got for Nigeria. Okay, here you have Malawi. Again, it is different. Malawi is different. So now the poor gain more than the rich. It's about 8% for the very, very poor, and it goes to about, what, less than 6% for the richer households. And again, it is because there are consumption. The results that I have, I want to say a few, give you some concluding thoughts. So typically when you think about trade and poverty and we have, shows that trade or tariff liberalizations can actually, in this kind of a static view, help reduce poverty. Obviously, the results are heterogeneous. You can have cases where trade can actually hurt the poor. So it is difficult to generalize, but the general impression that we get from the literature is that trade can help the poor. Of course, not everyone. So these are averages, and the averages obviously hide people that are So in this graph, we have the average is positive, but we can have people with very negative numbers and people with very positive numbers. So the averages are also the averages. We work with averages, but there is heterogeneity behind those, and obviously the issue there is to think about the complementary agenda. So when we talk about trade, poverty, and the formulas that I put in there, we have to make sure that we think about the mechanisms and that we make sure that the mechanisms works as the theory predicts. And for that, we need to think about concurrent, what we call the complementary agenda, which is policies that we take, that countries can implement concurrently with the trade reforms to boost the gains, to ameliorate losses, to reduce the losses, and to make the trade help the poor, these mechanisms work in practice. And that requires, of course, I don't want to peddle policy recommendations. I just want to say that there is a literature and a need to think about this complementary agenda, which I think we have some of that in the book. Okay, thank you. That's pretty much what I have.
Thank you so much, Guido. I think this was very useful to have this theoretical framework, and also then to see how it applies for different countries, and also to see these different countries' experiences, that not all countries have a poor trade opening, but also that in some countries the poor lost. Anyway, let's move on to the chapter by Frans. So Frans, the floor is yours.
Yes, Matthias, thank you very much. It was a great pleasure joining my fellow authors in this book. It's a great pleasure to be here, but perhaps next time you organize a panel, there could be a bit more gender balance. I realized that there are twice as many women in the audience as there are men, but I don't think the panel can balance that. So perhaps that's something for next time. It's something I will come back to at the end. I'm not a trade economist, so I don't have any models for you to show in a PowerPoint presentation. The only models I know to work with are the ones with my son when I make some Lego, also very nice. What I want to do is to talk a bit about the chapter I wrote with William Hines, and in a way what happened yesterday when I went to the first panel session about the development dimension of the WTO and the trading system, and Deb said something which is very true for aid for trade also. It's an old problem, but there is a new context. The old problem is still the same, that there is market access through multilateral trade liberalization, to regional trade liberalization, even unilateral, but that the poorest developing countries are not able to create market presence. And why is that? The problem is still the same. It's because they lack trade capacity. They lack also trade-related infrastructure and trade-related energy. So they have a deficit there. And in 2005, when there was still hope that the Doha Development Agenda would come to a conclusion, the idea of the Ministerial Council was to set up an initiative called Aid for Trade. And Lamy was asked to operationalize that. And contrary to what usually happens when there is a global problem, we didn't create a global fund. We didn't create a trust fund or so, because the problem was too big. And in a way, what the development and trade community agreed to in 2006 was to try to apply the Paris principles of aid effectiveness, which is very much aligning development cooperation around priorities set at the local level, set at the national level, and focus the development cooperation to achieve results. So this created this Aid for Trade initiative, which is basically a common agenda between the trade and development community about a number of clear commitments. The developing countries should prioritize trade as a an element in their development strategies around which then the development community would align their support. So support should increase. And there would be transparency, which would allow accountability to see if more and better aid for trade was really forthcoming. And so this is what the initiative is all about. So after 10 years, what has happened? Has it been an effective approach to a global problem? I think personally that it did, because in the development strategies of most developing countries, trade is now much more of a priority than it was before. That's not only because of the Aid for Trade initiative, but also, as DG Aga said, because of the enhanced integrated framework, which bring together a number of international organizations which provide technical assistance to really integrate trade as a priority in your development strategy. So first success, I think, is that trade is much more mainstream than it was before. Now, on the assumption that if that is a priority, did support to trade increase? Yes, it increased, because at the start of the initiative, support to trade policy and recommendations, to private sector development, and to trade-related infrastructure was around 25 billion. And it has increased now, last year, 2016 that we have data, it has increased from 25 to 58 billion. So that's more than doubling. And since the start of the initiative, something like 340 billion US dollars were spent on building trade capacities. So that's a significant amount of money. But it's not only about the amount of money, but does this amount of money really achieve the objectives of building trade capacities? Now, there have been many articles about it, academic articles, because the nice thing about it, this is a model which trade economists really like. We have this very detailed database about aid projects, which you can link to bilateral trade databases that UNCTAD has. And so there have been a lot of studies. Matthias has done a study on the benefits of trade facilitation. Every year these studies come out. We ourselves did one, and we found that $1 spent on aid for trade generates for all developing countries $8 extra of trade, and for the least developed countries $20 of extra trade. So this is a big impact. The other thing is we looked at evaluations, because the program has now been going on for 10 years, and most evaluations from donor programs are quite positive. Although it's very difficult, of course, when you try to follow the logical line, the logical framework between inputs, outcomes, and impacts, poverty reduction, which is all what we try to achieve. It's very difficult to say this project achieved this kind of poverty reduction objectives. But we also, in the context of improving transparency, asked developing countries to submit to us assessments. Does it work? Most of the time they say, yes, it does increase trade, yes, it does create employment, yes, it helps us to attract investment, it creates jobs for men and women. We also asked for case stories, which, you know, which increasingly is becoming much more important than the sort of academic work, because these stories allow people to say aid for trade generated employment for a small group of women traders in West Africa who are now able to send mangoes to the European Union, and because of that can send their children to school and acquire health benefits. So these case stories are very important, and I will also come back to that later a little bit. The other nice thing about the initiative I find myself, as opposed to creating a global trust fund, is it's a very flexible initiative, in the sense that when it created, the financial crisis erupted in 2007. So then the focus was, how can we maintain momentum towards support for providing trade capacity building. Then 2 years later we wanted to show results. So the focus was of the global review on aid for trade was on showing results. Then the global value chain discussion came up. So how can you use aid for trade to help small and medium-sized enterprises to link to global value chains and regional value chains? And the last one was cannot be bridged by development assistance. This has always been the case. Nobody ever thought that the development could be generated by development assistance. But the development community very much rallied around this idea that it's no longer development assistance which you do it, it's the private sector should really become an actor in development. Why? Well, because you know, the important part of financing your capacities, your productive capacities, is first by domestic finance, so you need to mobilize domestic finance, that's sort of half of it. Then you have foreign direct investment, which in 2030 was about 770 billion. 40% goes to the developing countries. Then you have remittances, which is about 400 billion, and then official development assistance is only 135 billion. So the story goes, development assistance is not very important anymore, and we should use it in a much more critical way to leverage foreign direct investment. But if you look at the, not at a global level, which is a sort of story we are attractive by offering a risk insurance, those kind of things. But then if you look at the money that is leveraged through these kind of instruments, you see that most of that kind of money, which we calculated in the order of 80 billion for the last 4 years, most of that money is in areas which are linked to aid for trade, but goes to the better of developing countries, whereas the big problem is, of course, in the LDCs. So, the finance for development is something new, but I don't think is personally, I don't think, and so, this is not the OECD thinking that. The OECD thinks this is a great idea. But personally, I think it's perhaps a thing which could be quite dangerous. The other thing is, which I will not go for, infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and linked to building productive capacity, link up to these different sustainable development goals, especially Goal 5 for inclusive and sustainable growth, Goal 8 to create decent work, Goal 10 to reduce inequality between countries and in countries, and the global partnership. So if you're interested, I think it's very interesting. So thank you. You hold it up or so on the camera. So what does it change? In a way, my colleague who couldn't be here, William Hines, works now at the OECD at what we call the new approaches to economic challenges. And this is very interesting, because despite the fact that we all think we know exactly what is wrong with the world, we messed up several times, and if we don't pay attention, we will mess up significantly, not only in achieving the sustainable development goals, but also leaving a world to our kids which they are not very happy with. So the big thing of that new approach to economic challenges is to come up with new models, but very clearly, and this was said yesterday by the Minister of Operations of the Netherlands, it is about breaking down silos between different policy communities. So aid for trade tries to do that between aid and trade, but what is clear also from this discussion about financing for development, it should also include investment. So it should be aid, trade, and investment. It should be a much broader dialogue, not only between the policymakers, but also with academia, but also with the private sector. And what is, I think, very, very necessary is, it's not a discussion between the OECD countries and non-OECD, the global discussion. So in aid for trade, it should no longer be aid for trade should no longer be the responsibility of just the DEC donors, but it's also the responsibility of the non-DEC donors. And there is a lot of money going into building infrastructure from the Chinese, but also the Indians. So there is probably some room for better coordination between hard and soft, which has disappeared very much over the last 10 years, but perhaps that is something that should become more to the forefront, that yes, there are adjustment costs from trade liberalization. And to finally end with this panel, this all-male panel, I think that the big thing that the Aid for Trade initiative should do is to look much more closer of how the effects of aid for trade are on gender in general, and more in specific in cases of how we provide development assistance. And this is a bit what the book says. I thought it was a great pleasure to work with it, and I very much liked reading the other chapters, and I highly recommend the book to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frans. Thank you. This was a nice overview of this Aid for Trade initiative, and I think it's important to see how this was an initiative that garnered so much support, and how it really helped to promote the trade agenda. And also I like your point about the private sector. Also at ADB we really try to bring in the private sector more and more, because we know that we cannot handle all of the development problems only by official development aid or by government interventions. Let's move on to Yann. I'm very much looking forward to having your comments, and also I think you will share some of your recent work, and it's a pleasure to listen to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So in fact, since you allowed me to present the book, I brought it with me. Right? So this is another book. And actually, I mean, it's nice, I think, because it's very complementary, what you've done with the book and what we have here. So I mean, but before I move on, maybe just let me thank Asian Development Bank Institute, ADBI, Matthias in particular, and also ITCSD, I think, for organizing the panel and inviting me to the panel. My general comment on the book, right, is that, I mean, I think all the participants already saw the outline, right? I mean, the depth of the analysis, you go into every single possible trade and SDG topic in there in a lot of details. And so I think if anyone, I mean, I feel it's kind of a must read for anyone who really was serious about trying to understand the link between linkage between trade and SDGs. And so, this is really my main comment in that sense, right? It's excellent background information for anyone who was thinking about how to use trade policy, okay, and moving forward and achieving sustainable development. Right? So and for us and for me, because I was charged for my organization. I'm from UN SCAP. UN SCAP is the Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific of the United Nations. We are the regional branch of the UN for all of Asia and the Pacific. So we cover 53 member states, or 62 if you count our associate members. So all the countries from Turkey and Iran, all the way to all the small Pacific Island countries and Australia and New Zealand as well. And so, because we are part of the UN and the UN Secretariat, we have a very strong mandate for that, for all of our work to streamline all the SDGs into them, right? And so I'm from the Trade and Investment Division of UN SCAP. And so what we've been trying to do is just that, right? Is trying to channel, and that's the title of the book and the title of my presentation, channel trade and investment into sustainable development. I don't know how to change slides.
Oh, here, sorry.
Thank you very much.
You want me to hold the book then up for you for this?
Yeah, thank you very much. So that's where you can find the book on channeling trade investment into sustainable development. We produce annually the Asia Pacific Trade and Investment Report, right? And every 2 years we focus on a specific theme. So the interesting thing is that this year it was specifically on that. And we feel that this is, for us, it's a very important topic because we are trying to revise everything we do on trade and investment to target it at sustainable development and achievement of the Sustainable Development Agenda. And this is really the main piece of the book. I mean, in preparing the book, what we've done is we organized an expert group meeting, bringing trade people, but also other people from environment side, from social side, and to discuss this issue, right? Can we put together into one picture the linkage between trade, foreign direct investment, and sustainable development, right? So some of you, if you're experts, you may think, wow, this is very simplistic, this is too simple, whatever. But the purpose of the book is not for academia. It's actually for policymakers, right? And so we try to put this together into one framework, in a way, on channeling trade and investment into sustainable development. And so you can see here, I can walk you a little bit through the framework. And it took a day and a half of negotiation between all the experts to come up with this, believe it or not. Because one of the interesting contribution, I guess, or difference between this picture and this framework and some of the other things that we normally put on trade is that we specifically recognize some of the risks and some of the problems and the negative sides associated with trade and FDI, right? So if you can start reading the picture from the left side, trade and FDI, that is generally promoted through trade liberalization and investment liberalization and promotion, that results in great benefits. I mean, great aggregate level economic benefits and economic growth in general. I mean, I think there is lots of evidence that you liberalize trade, you liberalize investment, you achieve economic growth, right? And so that contributes, some of the contributions that we've identified is higher government revenues from trade, lower prices, more variety, higher consumption, higher productions, better inputs, technology, and on the FDI side also increased capital base and also technology transfer and know-how, right? So I think those things are very important, and I think there is a lot of support about all the benefits. You have to think about the environmental health impact from higher consumption and production. You have to think about risk of crowding out domestic investments and job losses in some industries. Just again, adjustment cost, I think you were talking about this. And also there is always environmental and social impact associated with large infrastructure development projects, right? So this is not to say that trade and investment is not a key means of implementation of sustainable development. It is, right? But it's important to also recognize those potential side effects so we can try and address them. And so how do you address them? And this is what we argue in the book. And I think it's very much in line with the message that I've seen from both the presentation and in the book, right? First, there is some room for targeted trade and investment policies. So what do we mean by targeted trade investment policies? Targeted at what? Targeted at the Sustainable Development Goals. There is, in the SDGs, there is some specific sectors that are identified. Education, health, energy, renewable energy, all those things, right? So let's target some of the investment policies and promotions towards some of those SDG supportive sectors. That's one aspect. What kind of other, on the trade side, SDG targeted policies, we can think about tariff cuts on environmental goods. This is not something that is new. If you look at the APEC initiative, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, they actually, since 2012, they agreed. They made a list of environmental goods, and they actually agreed to reduce and cut tariff on those environmental goods. And so now they've implemented it, right? So this is one way to target trade policies towards more sustainable development as well. One of the most bit controversial things that we put in the book is we actually argue that non-tariff measures incorporating sustainability standards may actually be useful in channeling trade into sustainable development, right? So increasing non-tariff measures by incorporating sustainability standards is something to think about. Obviously, you have to be very careful with this because you don't want the non-tariff measures to turn into non-tariff barriers, right? So you have to find a way to ensure that compliance to the non-tariff measures be as easy as possible for SMEs and so on. So you have to go with automation, you have to go with really streamlining all those compliance procedures, including through mutual recognition agreements of compliance and testing facilities and so on. So that's on the targeted trade and investment policy side. This is one component of how you can channel trade investment more into sustainable development. I think two of the speakers talked about the complementary policies. So that's also, every chapter I think in the book mentioned the importance of complementary policies. You can't do everything with trade. Big message of this book and also our book is trade is a necessary component of sustainable development, so it's essential, but it's not sufficient, and so complementary policies are very important. So what kind of complementary policies? So this is really very difficult topic as well, but thinking about the three dimensions of the sustainable development, trade and FDI can really help in boosting economic growth. There is no question about that. And so what's important at the domestic level is labor and environmental policies, right? You need to make sure that the people, for example, will lose their jobs because of reallocation of resources because of trade competition and trade liberalization. Those people have social safety nets. I mean, can have social safety nets and then rebuild themselves to move to other sectors, right? Easier said than done, but those are very essential in ensuring that trade contributes to sustainable development. Education policies, competition policies, also very important. So that was the second element, complementary domestic policies. Two other enablers of trade for sustainable development we identified. One is good governance, and again, this is nothing new. Why good governance? Good governance is about rule of law, is about basically being able to implement the policies, right? It's very nice to design very nice targeted trade and investment policies, very nice to implement, to design very nice complementary domestic policies. But in many developing countries, the policies are not implemented. There is no compliance, that is no enforcement of the policies, right? So good governance, institutional capacity building, really actively fighting corruption, and is essential to channel trade into sustainable development. And many countries have understood this. I mean, if you look at, for example, China, I mean, they are fighting corruption, I mean, in a very, very big way. It's a very central component of the way they are trying to develop now, right? So that's the third component. The fourth component, and that's trade facilitation. What do we mean by trade facilitation? Reducing trade transactions at multilateral level to cut tariffs on that kind of, on medicines, for example, would make a lot of sense in some sense, right? Or should be considered. Okay, so that's the general framework, and we elaborate on this, and we actually refer a lot to some of the chapters of the ADB book in the discussion of the framework. We also have a little bit we try to test and do some simulations of different trade policy scenarios, right? So if you go again to that web address that I gave you, you can actually, we have an interactive tool there where you can see the impact of different trade liberalization scenarios, trade investment and trade facilitation liberalization scenarios on GDP, on economic growth, but also on inequality, also on CO2 emissions on the environmental side, and so on. So you can play around with this. I just did a screen capture here just to show that definitely doesn't matter if you look at tariff liberalization, investment liberalization, trade facilitation scenarios, they all clearly contribute to economic growth, no matter how we look at it. And it's a regional study, right? So we look at different sub-regions, and so all sub-regions basically benefit from trade and investment liberation. So definitely that's an important message. There's no way, trade protectionism is not the solution, right? No matter how you look at it, right? For sustainable development. But one interesting thing, sorry, it's a little bit small, but for example, if you look at the yellow bar there, yellow bar is a trade facilitation scenario. And you can see the impact of trade facilitation on GDP growth, economic growth, is actually much higher than tariff liberalization and much higher than also investment liberalization, right? And it accounts for most of the gains that you can see from an integrated approach to trade and investment and liberalization. So I just want to note, this is actually my area of specialty, trade facilitation, so I can't resist but tell you a little bit about this. Sorry about that. We just issued, actually last Saturday, we just issued the result of the United Nations Global Survey on trade facilitation and paperless trade implementation. So we have a whole database now that you can take a look at. But just the message here is that there is a lot of room for every country to make progress on trade facilitation, right? Many countries have implemented the WTO trade facilitation agreement, but the TFA is just a baseline, right? A lot of things you can do in the term of automation, paperless trade, and cross-border paperless trade to move forward on trade facilitation, right? So you're welcome to look at the result of the survey as well. Here I'm highlighting that the issue of cross-border paperless trade, so that's enabling the electronic exchange of trade-related data and documents across countries, is something that needs a lot of work in the area of trade facilitation. And the other area that needs a lot of work in trade facilitation is trying to actually implement measures, transition measures that are good for sustainable development, that are good for SMEs, that are good for agriculture sector, right? Because they face different types of procedures, and also enable engagement of women in trade, right? So the survey we have covers some of those issues, and I think that's very relevant aspect also of linking trade into sustainable development, right? So going back, that's my parenthesis on trade facilitation, sorry. Going back, now if you look at the different trade and investment liberalization scenarios we have, you find that integrated liberalization, where you have a joint approach, combination of trade liberalization, investment liberalization, trade facilitation, actually is the best in terms of trying to achieve sustainable outcomes, reducing inequality, reducing CO2 emissions, mitigating CO2 emissions, and so on. But that's not enough, right? You can see here, out of 5, I think, sub-regions we are looking at in Asia and the Pacific, 3, you can see inequality increases with trade and investment liberalization, and 2 or 3, trade investment liberation decreases, right? So you need still those complementarity policies. And so that's actually what we look at. In the book, we try to see, once you bring the complementary domestic policies and combine in our region, the Belt and Road initiatives in China is potentially something that is very, very good and useful for the integrated sustainable development of the region, right? Obviously, the environmental and social aspects have to be monitored, but I think that's very good. Challenges in terms of moving forward on this is that one size does not fit all, so very difficult to actually identify which targeted trade investment policies are right for certain countries. I was amazed by the result from the trade and poverty chapter, where you can see a lot of variation, right, across countries, right? So, I mean, Uganda, trade, the poor benefit the most, right? The other countries, the rich benefit the most, right? So a lot of adjustments to be there, and I think there is a lot of more analysis that needs to be done to get the right policy mix, right? And one of the challenges we identified in the study is the missing data. Even for the existing set of Sustainable Development Goals indicators, what are very basic and actually not adequate, right? They only measure the quantity of trade, not the quality of trade. We don't have data in a lot of the least developed countries, right? So a lot of work needs to be done with the statistical offices in the developing countries to get this data, so the right policy mix can be put together. And if you want more information, you're welcome to look at our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yann. And it's good to see that we work side by side and try to push this agenda of trade and SDGs. And in your presentation, I think you nicely highlighted the need for complementary policies and also the question of good governance. We have about 10 minutes left for Q&A, so I would like to open the floor now and would like to see whether there's any question to our panelists on this topic of trade and SDGs. Yes?
Thank you very much. Matthias, my name's Alice Tipping. I work at the ICTSD, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk to this panel. We were really pleased to have this panel as part of the Trade and Sustainable Development Symposium. We've been doing a lot of work also on the Trade and Sustainable Development Goal connections, and I was pleased to see a number of references to the work that we've done in your book, so that was encouraging. I wondered if I could pick up on a point that, Frans, you made about the need for a story. And it reminds me also of a point that Rick Sammons from the World Economic Forum made at yesterday's plenary about the need to think about the role that trade plays in serving essentially a higher purpose. Right? What is it that trade contributes to improving living standards, for example? And if you think about the difficulty the WTO is having in reaching kind of a political agreement on what the role of trade liberalization should be in development, I wonder if there's a role for, as you say, kind of more of a focus on the narrative and more of a focus on the broader purposes that trade serves, not just kind of trade for the sake of trade, but trade for a higher purpose. And I wondered if I could kind of link that to the results that you'd presented about the role of trade liberalization and the impact on income distribution and on incomes in households. And I wondered, perhaps this is in the chapter, but could you tell us what the story is behind some of those graphs? Why is it, as far as you can tell, that the results vary so dramatically? Or even sort of for a couple of the graphs, why is it, for example, that trade has a particularly positive effect for the poorer but not for the richer of the community? So I wonder if you could give us a bit of the story behind the graphics to the extent you're able. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this very good question. So maybe Frans would like to...
No, the question is for me.
Because the essential point is that we have I don't know, in Ghana, for example, we have probably 20,000 of, and then we have 20,000 stories. And we have one graph to show, no? The thing is, so the basic channels that we look at here is the income side and the consumption side. Within those, you have, on the HS, probably 8,000 lines of tariffs, and there is variation across those and across countries. So you can have a country with a high tariff in this good, another country with a high tariff on another good, different set of goods. So the initial structural protection of the different countries matters. Then you have the household as a consumer. And then some households consume a lot of this good, and some others consume a lot of wheat, some others maize, some others textiles, some others services, and so on and so forth. And there is heterogeneity across the 20,000 observations that you have in the data and across all countries, okay? So it goes, in general, we have Engel law. So the only thing that we know is that the poor consume proportionately more of food than the rich. But that's the only law that we have in terms of consumption patterns. So there is a lot of heterogeneity on the tariffs. There is a lot of heterogeneity on the consumption bundles. And then there is even more heterogeneity on the income side. You have households earning money from farming. Others do labor income. Others do a combination of those. Others do get money from remittances. Others are totally isolated and produced for home consumption. There is heterogeneity in the data within a country and across countries. So when you put all that together, you can get heterogeneous results, no? And I understand that my role as a researcher is to try to address your comment. I have not been totally successful in doing that because, again, I have to show 20,000 results to be able to do that. I can break down some of these graphs into, for example, consumption, the impacts of trade on consumption, whether it comes from agriculture, whether it is generated in manufacturing trade or services, other non-tradables, and so on and so forth, and we have results on that. And also for the income side. And in general, what the message that we get typically is that most of the poor countries protect agriculture a lot, more than manufacturing. To some extent, some of these agricultural products are food products. So when you cut the tariffs, and remember we're talking only about tariff cuts, no? There are also investment and so on. Okay, I'm not addressing those. But when you cut the tariffs, then you have a larger impact on food products, and these are consumed to a larger extent by the poor. So there are a lot of benefits for the poor on that side. They are also being hurt on the income side because as much as they consume a lot of wheat and maize and so on, they also produce some of that. But in the data, because these are poor countries, they tend to spend more, the budget share, the consumption channel seem to dominate the income channel for many of these countries, not for all of them. Okay. And then there is just one more technical thing. There is also heterogeneity in the income data, in the household surveys. So the questionnaires are different across countries, the coverage is different, the sampling is different, no? So some are better than others and so on, and so that's all I can, okay.
Thank you very much, Guido. I think it's also a nice case to show that, yeah, it all depends on the country. We need to really look at every country very carefully. Are there any other questions? We have about 2-3 minutes left. Any comments? Okay, so let me then conclude. And first of all, thank you all to the panelists for joining us this morning. Let's give them a big hand.
Thank you.
Can you read
and also thank you very much for coming, the participants. It was great to have you all here. And please download the 2 books from UNESCAP and ADBI and enjoy the read. Thank you very much.
Thank you.